Welcome to Legacy Conversations, a channel where we preserve military memories and history.
Greetings, folk. Dag sê.
Thank you for joining me here for a very, very quick one. Koos and Rebecca have graciously invited me to leave you a link, wherever we put the link, to my Buy Me a Coffee page. Yes, please, if you're happy with the edit of this, or if I occasionally host a video, I'd appreciate your feedback and or you buying me a coffee, a beer, a glass of wine, or even maybe a small whiskey. But I'm going to categorically state, for the Legacy Conversations where this gets used, all that money is going to be reserved for a very special project, of which you will hear all about soon. So thank you very much. I do appreciate your contributions. Thank you, Donkey. Bye.
Hello everyone, I'm excited here and I must tell you I've got reason to be excited because I've got a commanding officer here of 24 Squadron, Eskader, as I would say in Afrikaans in the old days before Fossie got hold of me, was from 16 Squadron. I would have talked about an escadron or something, and yeah, well, he taught me two things, this fellow. He said to me in the first place, there ain't such a thing as a vlugingenieur in the SAF. It doesn't exist. As a boordtechnicus, whenever I say these things, I see his face. He wasn't unfriendly, but he was definitely not happy with my way of speaking about the SAF. And there's another thing which he taught me also, but that I forgot for now. Colonel, you are so welcome here. Thank you, sir. I'm really grateful for your presence. May I ask you, where did this start for you? How did you end up in the SAF? Were your parents perhaps in the military? Was your dad perhaps flying? Or you were first of a family?
Thank you, Koos. Just to mention a little part of your training and talking about a flight engineer or a boordtechnicus. I also in Afrikaans got very upset when people talk about a loods. To me, a loods is the place where aircraft has been parked into for nighttime purposes. In Afrikaans, it's a vlieënier and not a loods. Okay. Yeah, I was born in September 1951 in Otjiwarongo, Namibia, or Southwest Africa in those days. My father then was a farmer, and eventually we moved to Walvis Bay, where I matriculated in 1969. And from Walvis Bay, had no contact with actually aircraft before, but as a small little child, I built a lot of model aeroplanes, and I wanted to join, obviously, the Air Force. And since the age of about 10, I think I was one of the few kids that didn't change what I wanted to be, and when I told the other guys I want to be a pilot. They wanted to be ambulance drivers and speed cops and policemen and doctors and whatever, and I just stick with my guns to become a pilot. After matriculated, which was called up to the South African Air Force, although I applied to become a pilot already, and they called me up for national service to the Air Force gym in 1970, where it was quickly that we were put into groups to do our medical fitness and selection board, and I was lucky to be selected. The figures we had was about 2,400 applicants, of which 70 were selected to attend the military academy for the phase 2 officers training course at the military academy. It was the first officers training. Every pilot in the Air Force becomes an officer, and which makes it a difference because the fighting force in the Air Force are all officers. and where the army had mainly the national servicemen or the infantry, a lot of troops do the fighting part. So in 1970, I was selected Air Force Military Academy at Saldanha, and in the end of that year, October, we went over to Langebaanweg for our flight training. Training in those days were 2 bases, Langebaanweg, trained on Impalas, and another group trained in Denotter. The whole PUPS course, 180 odd hours, happened in those 2 bases, where we received our wings, and the wings parade was in the end of 71, December 71, where out of the 70, 26 eventually received their wings. Also maybe a different story about the standards and the training that happened. But that was it. After the wings, I was selected. We were 4 guys out of the whole group that was selected to continue training on jets, on Impalas, and I was sent to Petersburg, 1 squadron for interim period, flying Impalas and do a weapons training at Petersburg. I got back to Langebaan for operational training course, official operation training course at Langebaanweg in about 72, and then 73, 74 was posted to Petersburg again, and then 4 squadron at Waterkloof. From there, I went to Denotter to become an Air Force instructor. In those days, it was felt that the only way that we could pay back the cost of our training was to become an instructor. And every pilot in the Air Force had to do an instructor's course, where we then trained another pilot for the Air Force. And in 75, 70, up to about 77, 78, Denotter, then I went to Petersburg, where I did Impala Attack Instructor's course, which we call a PAI at Petersburg, and I stayed behind as a pilot attack instructor for 3 years on Impalas in Petersburg. In that time, the Bush War escalated, and we trained, and eventually we were told as instructors we had to go to do a bush tour or 2, so that we know how the pilots fly and operate in the bush, so that we can train them the way we're going to fight, and not fight the way we train. Well, we fight the way we trained, and not train the way we fight. In that sense. So up to that stage, end of the last half of 81, I was instructed in Petersburg. Couple of bush tours, also was part of the original beginning part of the Maanskyn night attack group of the Air Force, doing night attacks in Angola. End of 81, I did Mirage course, Mirage 3, and that was a requirement for any pilot to go to Buccaneer. So in January, February of 82, I joined the Buccaneer squadron. The Buccaneer is designed as a tactical low-level bomber aircraft, mainly operated from aircraft carriers for the Royal Navy, which at those days were the only other military branch that operated Buccaneer, South African 24 Squadron and the Royal Navy. Eventually, later on, in later phases of the 80s, the Royal Navy disbanded their Buccaneers, and I think they got more Phantoms on their aircraft carriers, and the Buccaneers of the British Buccaneers joined the Royal Air Force. Okay, my training and the Buccaneer itself. The Buccaneer, as I mentioned, is quite a big aeroplane. It is a foot shorter in length than a Dakota for reference ways. And the empty weight of the Buccaneer, without bombs or fuel, we were 5,000 pounds more heavy than a Dakota with its maximum takeoff weight. So it gives you a little bit of a viewpoint of what the Buccaneer was. The aircraft was as I mentioned, a low-level tactical strike aircraft. The majority of our flying happened at low level, that is 200 feet sometimes eventually in a war area up from 50 feet to not higher than 100, 150 feet maximum. And the aircraft did not operate well at high altitude. In the 70s, the main armament of the Buccaneer was basically what we call dumb bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, followed by rockets, 68mm rockets. We had a little bit of AS-30 air-to-surface missiles, which was a little bit more accurate than the bombs. But it was a difficult, or not a difficult, but it was a dangerous type of profile to fly. You had to be very close to the enemy, especially in the dive bombs mode. We developed an aspect that we called medium toss. The aircraft goes in low-level pull-up, and in that climb, the bombs will come off and fly towards the target in the vicinity of 4 nautical miles, 8 kilometers odd, towards the target, and we would do an escape maneuver coming out of the attack. That made it a little bit more safe. But the bombs were not accurate. In that toss mode, we can say the average miss distance, or the accurate distance of a single bomb was an average of 70 to 100 meters from the target. But then if you carry 8 bombs each aircraft, and you got 4 aircraft throwing bombs as 32,000-pound bombs, it's an area weapon that will cover quite a large area to be bombed. In the 70s, there was a need for a more accurate precision bomb. And the Air Force started with a project which they then called Hantu. Hantu 1 was a 1,000-pound bomb with a television camera on the nose and a little bit of controlling surfaces at the end. And in that toss mode, or even in the dive bomb mode, the navigator could control the bomb onto the target. And they increased the accuracy of the bomb to about 10 meters, which was good, but still not a precision bomb the way that the Americans talk about precision bombing in today's world. Hantu developed to Hantu 2, where a new bomb was built, not a 1,000-pound bomb, but a new bomb was built with a little bit of folding wings. I will show you a picture of the Hantu, of the H-2 bomb. It changed call signs to Templum, and eventually today, if you go Raptor, you will find a lot of information on the internet about the Raptor. So the H-2 bomb itself, the dimensions was a bomb that was 3.65 meters long, just about 12 feet. The wingspan was 3.7 meters, just over 12 feet. And the weight of the bomb was 980 kilograms. Where a 1,000-pound bomb, that gives you 2,100 pounds of bomb load. A couple of warheads were developed, like HE, which was mainly anti-personnel, soft-skin vehicles for radars, quite an effective bomb with little ball bearings that scattered our area. Then a penetration bomb, which we call a buster bomb, of a bunker buster bomb, and eventually at the end, the H-2 bomb would have become the South African Air Force nuclear bomb with the nuclear head, of which we had 5, 6 bombs ready to be used by 88, 89 area in that area. The control of the bomb. It had a television camera in the nose, then the explosive part, and the back part was the control surfaces and for the bomb itself. The bomb had little wings that fold open underneath, and then flies looks like a little, let's call it a Sabre jet when it's in the air. It's TV guided, which means that it is visual light that you require for the bomb. And that was most probably in those days the biggest disadvantage of the bomb. it was that we could only use it in daytime. Later developments of the bomb was to put an infrared camera into the nose so that we can use it at nighttime maybe, or even through cloud for a radar seeker guidance system, and eventually GPS. With the accuracy of GPS, today, I think the majority of all precision bombs today are GPS guided. In those days, with the accuracy of GPS itself, it was not worthwhile looking into GPS. And then obviously all the satellites were controlled by the Americans in wartime. And the threat that they could switch off the GPS coverage, then our bombs would be totally useless to be used. That is basically the bomb itself. I got onto the project in 1984 on the squadron, and in those days it was called Templum, and with the clearance and pre-qualification qualification of the bomb with the South African Air Force, did a lot of sorties flying in Uppington, in Rimvarsmark, and at Vastrap Ranges, and for the development, the navigator was Commandant Sandy Roy. I was a major in those days as a pilot. And the way the bomb operates, the pilot will go and fly the airplane to a launch point where he will then, from outside references, launch the bomb. The bomb had a range of 60 kilometers, basically 30 nautical miles that it could fly. Once it's released from the aircraft, it will glide, the wings open, it will glide at 250 knots. Now, knots to kilometers, it's actually the conversion is 1.825, but quick conversion is times 2. So 250 knots gives you almost 500 kilometers an hour. That is, the bomb will fly at that glide at that speed. For the bomb to be launched or to fly 60 kilometers, we had to be basically 32,000 feet above the ground for the bomb to fly that distance. Now, the profile of the bomb will come off the airplane at 32,000 feet above ground. It will fly, and the navigator will navigate the bomb according to the route if you can't see the whole distance or the target area. By using crossroads or rivers or little hills or whatever, he will navigate the bomb, steer the bomb towards the target. When the camera looks down at 45 degrees, you will go target acquire, and the bomb will go into the dive towards the target, and in the dive, the bomb will accelerate to almost the speed of sound, and then stay locked and hit the target on the prefab, HE bomb, prefrag, or the ground penetration bomb. Now, as I mentioned, limitations of the bomb. What we used was a TV-guided bomb, daytime only. Cloud was a problem. We had a restriction of 3/8 of cloud, which is say 40% air covering of cloud. We were not allowed to release the bomb. You had to see the target physically for the release. Another big limitation was maybe the aircraft itself. The aircraft, the Buccaneer, had no defensive weapons against an enemy aircraft in the air. We had electronic countermeasures for radars and for missiles that fired at us, but we could not fight a fighter aircraft. So that was a big limitation. Whenever we flew operations or lots of hours of training and practice in South Africa, where the Mirage squadrons one squadron will fly escort to us, and the other squadron will attack us, and we develop aspects to stay safe in that aspect. And touch wood maybe. On all the training and all the years, I have never been attacked by a Mirage successfully. I always had the little joke with my Mirage pilot friends: if you can catch me, you can kiss me. And I say at this stage, I've never been kissed by a Mirage pilot. So we had our aspects that we could get away. And one of the main examples or the main benefits of the Buccaneer was to fly low level. And if you go low level, for a Mirage to try and attack you at 500 knots, 1,000 kilometers an hour, and you are sitting 100 feet, 150 feet above the ground, there's no ways that he can fire a missile at you. And with his guns, he will not get a tracking solution on the aircraft. And we accepted that would be the same for a MiG-21 or a MiG-23 aspect. The fuel use of the Buccaneer at 480, 500 knots with 2 engines, the Buccaneer used less fuel than a Mirage with 1 engine by itself at that speed. So, and we carried just over 15,000 pounds of fuel when we get airborne. So we could go miles at very high speed without getting a shortage of fuel, where the Mirage cannot do that high-speed dash, or so a MiG-21 or a MiG-23, and running out of fuel, especially if they are running away, chasing you away from their base. They had to stop the attack and go back. I will mention, after the successful attack, I will mention a little story for me and a Mirage pilot in that sense. What happened then? Okay, with Ops, Modular and Hooper, okay, first must be mentioned, for a Buccaneer, to climb, you will accelerate low level to maximum speed, which is, according to the books, is 580 knots. And then you will zoom climb to altitude to 32,000 feet above the ground. That climb will take 6 to 7 minutes, which is quite a long time. But you can release the bomb at lower altitudes and make the distance to the target shorter. And that was the profile we mainly used in Angola for the bomb, and we planned, and that was a 40-kilometer launch, 20 nautical miles launch, and that's 20,000 feet above the ground. So you will zoom climb to that, and it will take you just over 3 minutes to that altitude. For the launch, the aircraft turned back in the direction that it came, opposite direction, and the navigator controlled the bomb by means of a little control stick in the cockpit and a TV screen, and he will tell the bomb where the target is. While the pilot is flying away from the target, you can descend low level, but then there's a probability that you can lose radio contact with the bomb, and the steering commands could be lost. That gives you, say, 3-4 minutes climb to altitude, identify a release point, release the bomb. If you talk about 20 nautical miles at 250 knots, that gives you another 5 minutes for the bomb to get to the target. That is 9 minutes overall, which is quite a long time. So we developed a system that another aircraft can stay at low level, outside the radar coverage of the enemy. And after the bomb is released, the release aircraft immediately gets out of the way, immediately go down. Now, I've read in the books, and I believe it's true, that a Buccaneer had the capability of roll inverted, dive down to the ground, open the dive brakes at the back, and go down to at about 40,000 feet per minute down to earth, which leaves us very little time, and it leaves little time for attacking aircraft to attack you at that, if you are compromised on radar, to get out of the radar screen for them. But that was a buddy mode that was developed. Training for operations. We also had the Boeing, the 707 of the Air Force, which with the ELINT capability. The ELINT capability is detection of radars on the ground, and they could pick up all communication on VHF radios on the ground. And I think even they could pick up HF communication as well. So the Boeing would go into the area an hour or so before the strike time and listen and monitor the radars on the air, and then the fighter movements. Even Space Forces had troops outside Manongwe and Kwitu Carnival that monitored aircraft movements. Whenever an aircraft got airborne, they would inform the operation parts in Rundu, in Windhoek and in Pretoria about what aircraft is airborne, which then transferred the message to the Boeing. The Boeing would tell us. So the rules of engagement for us was firstly limitations on the weather. We were not allowed to use the bomb with 3/8, 4/8 cloud cover, although at the end I will give you a little bit of a video, and the cloud cover was maybe, let's call it 3.5/8 or 4/8. Some other guys will say it was even more when I released the bomb eventually on the target. And then whenever there were fighters in the air, we will not pitch to altitude for the release if the fighter is in the target vicinity. And that was the responsibility of the Boeing to give us that information. Towards the end of Operations Modular and Hooper, September, October, November of 1978, 87, we configured back for the H2 as an operational weapons to be used. The first target was selected for us was Manongwe Airport or Manongwe runways. And just to show you also limitation of the weapon, on the 12th of November in 1978, 1987, we trained with 3 aircraft in the Grootfontein area. All 3 aircraft got bird strikes. And the one aircraft, number 3 aircraft, even had a bird strike on the bomb, which rendered the bomb unserviceable. So flying low level, birds are always a threat. And even a little swallow on the TV screen of the weapon will actually make that weapon totally useless. The first strike was planned for the 20th of November, and I think the Recce forces in the area of Manongwe informed us that it's cloud cover all around Manongwe. So that attack was postponed for the next day, the 25th of November. We got airborne with 3 aircraft. My aircraft carried two weapons, H2 weapons, and I was number 2 in the formation. The lead aircraft was Commandant Lapis Kagni, which was the officer commanding of the squadron at that stage, with Neil Napier as his navigator. My navigator was Rimaton. And Giel van der Berg and Peter Kirkpatrick stayed low level in the buddy mode in case one of the launch aircraft couldn't release or couldn't control their bomb after release. And they were about 10 miles behind us at low level. We had 3 squadron. Eventually, the chief of the Air Force, then Commandant Carlo Gagliano, was the escort from 3 squadron on the 2 Buccaneers flying next to each other, and we had 4 F1s doing the escort. Now, the target was 1/3. The aircraft is the runway is east-west. The first bomb would have been 1/3 from the east, and my bomb was 1/3 from the west onto the target area. Just before release, climbing to 21,000 feet above ground level, my navigator, Rimaton, told me that we will not be able to release a bomb because there's a circuit breaker, red light warning that the bombs cannot be released for some reason or another. I stayed in formation, what we call mutual support, lookout with the leader, and on a release point, the leader did not release. And he also had a system fault. So we broke off, returned back to Grootfontein. At that time, you cannot get the number 3 aircraft into the pitch because we were being compromised by radars already from Monongwe. Since we climbed through about 6,000 feet up to 21,000 feet, we were illuminated by radars, and we got all the warnings that the radars are looking at us. There were no threat radars, and according to the Boeing, there were no fighters then at that time flying in the air as well. So we were fairly safe on that attack. But 10 miles behind, another aircraft coming could have been a different story. So we turned back to Grootfontein. On my aircraft, they found a fault. It was a connector fault, 21-point connector, where one of the pins were bent and didn't make contact. So we wouldn't have been able to release even if we tried anything we could. And the lead aircraft, I don't know exactly what was their problem, but I think the communication spot and the bomb. Once the bomb has been released, the radio communication, they had a problem with their communication spot. The Air Force decided, or the military powers to be at that stage decided that the sortie must be redo the next day. From my point of view, I was very upset and I let myself heard that this is really, what's the saying, scratching the lion's ass with a toothpick. Because you're attacking now infrastructure for the MPLA, and the Air Force, the Defence Force at that stage had no means to protect the whole of the northern Southwest Africa area. Where we were sitting Grootfontein and Rundu, Ondangwa Oshikati was vulnerable, and even the MiG-23s from Lubanga can easily reach Windhoek if they had to go that way. So the attack on Monongwe was maybe not a good call. The other aspect was, it was maybe the army that forces the Air Force to attack and take Monongwe out of the loop. But then again, the FAPLA forces, the Angolan Air Force, was not very successful with attacks on our troops on the ground. So, yes, they could not move around with the dust trails they caused when they moved from point A to repositioned, and they were restricted in their movements. But again, as I say, divine intervention. We had the 2 hang-ups, and the next day's call was eventually cancelled by the Air Force, and we did not continue with the attack on Monongwe. Then the emphasis changed to Cuito Carnaval. Cuito Carnaval, 4 brigades to the eastern side of the river, quite a big Angolan force. Our troops were hazard, and everything they get onto Cuito Carnaval either had to be land transported over a single bridge at Cuito Carnaval over the Cuito River, or by helicopters doing the resupply. Now, just before then, at that stage, the Air Force shot down, I think, 4 helicopters in one day with Impalas in that area, and the next day they shot down another 1 or 2, I'm not totally sure. So the helicopter resupply from the Angolan Air Force also got to a grinding halt. So the Cuito Carnaval Bridge was a very strategic route for them to take the material and resupply their troops on the ground. And that became then the most important strategic target for us to attack. The attack route would have been from the south on follow the Cuito River, basically. The same standoff distance 40 kilometers, 20 nautical miles, 21,000 feet above the ground, release the bomb. And in this case, we only used 2 Buccaneers. The one Buccaneer stayed low level, and I pitched to altitude to release the bomb. Because the breach was so small, we didn't need 2 aircraft, 2 different aiming points. So the Boeing was in the air again, early morning. There were 2 recce positions north and south of the breach. Asked questions about the weather in the target area. The Boeing would get airborne almost an hour before the strike time, monitoring movements of fighters, the radars on the air, and then we will then, according to that, get into our aircraft, get airborne at Grootfontein, and fly towards the target area, the breach at Monongwe. 2 sorties were planned for the 8th of December, which we flown. And the first one, early morning takeoff, the bomb was US. So we returned back. And then later that afternoon, I got airborne again. But then now, being September, our December month, January, with all the convection and air and being basically tropical area, clouds form in the afternoons. And the weather was such that we couldn't release the bomb. I didn't even pitch in both of these occasions. At the pitch point, I just stayed low level, turned back. We were never on radars, and the enemy never knew that we were in the area to attack the breach. On the 12th of December, we got airborne, and we ran in for the attack. We pitched, climbed to altitude, released the bomb, and turned to the right. And Neil Napier was my navigator, Rimaton and who was the number 2? But they stayed low level, and the bomb flew. Nothing wrong with the attack, and it gone into the water. We landed back at Grootfontein, very high, psyched up about this first attack, successful. And then the message came through that the breach has not been damaged at all. That's most probably from the 2 recce advantage points at south and north of the breach, which could see the breach, and by means of telescopes and binoculars, they saw that the breach is not damaged. And we didn't know what and why and how. And then we got messages from Brush, which listened to all communications in Angola, where Cuito Carnaval reported back to Monongwe and Luanda that the South Africans sent the aircraft towards Cuito. They shot it down. It landed in the river, and it is still in the water. When there was a question, what happened to the pilots? The answer from Cuito gone back to Monongwe and Luanda saying they don't know, but they assume the pilots are still inside of the aeroplane, underneath the breach in the water. So that gives an indication and a thought that the bomb did not detonate. There was no mention on their part about a big explosion and water spout going into the air and a big bang. It's an aircraft shot down and it landed in the water. So it was big and quick discussions. So the next day, it was decided that the attack must be repeated. And obviously, as it happens, then the number 2 aircraft became the lead. And they flew, and Neil and myself were the backup aircraft at low level, and they went into the climb. They released their bomb, and as the aircraft got 45 degrees, looked down altitude and gone into the bund, just after that, the bomb exploded. Or didn't explode, but they lost all communications with the bomb. Now, the bomb goes up at very high speed. If you talk about Mach 0.9, almost speed of sound, the aerodynamic forces on that bomb is quite big, or in any aircraft at that stage. So a lot of multiple things could have happened. And I mentioned the bird strike in the beginning of the talk. And if you see the bomb, it got Shackleton fins at the back. And we had one case where the fin was struck by a small little bird and it actually popped open where the antennas were inside. So if that happened and the bomb goes into supersonic speed, that part will just disintegrate and then there's no communication. But obviously, nobody will ever know because we could never get to the bomb. Where it landed on the ground, no explosion was called even 10 miles short of the breach. So there was a little bit of a massive anticlimax about the H2. The 15th of December, with all the telephone calls going to and fro, Kentron been involved. The squadron returned back to Waterkloof for a massive debrief at 24 Squadron with Kentron personnel, and then Dr. Vernon joined from Mechem company. He had first-hand experience that he walked over that breach before, a year or two before Hooper Modular happened. He had all the knowledge about that breach and the vulnerability of that breach at all for the bomb or not. So we could pull him in to give us information. The Kentron people, they were adamant to argue the point of detonation or not. And according to them, it was not a failure in detonation. But the messages that we got from the ground, and eventually everybody agreed not to continue with all the arguments. I still believe the bomb did not detonate for some reason or another. And we were then put on hold at Waterkloof to return back to Grootfontein. And we had a good break in the war between 15th December and in the morning, every morning I had to phone Air Force headquarters for a weather report, a possible weather report in the Mavinga area. And then at about 7:30 in the morning was the normal call time. At 7:30 they told me the weather is bad. And me and the wife and the kids had a good time. Boxing Day, planning quite a feast at home and relax after the Christmas dinner. And then at 8:10 they phoned and said, listen, the weather is going to clear up. Get your bums back to Grootfontein. So then Giel van der Berg, Peter Kirkpatrick, myself, and Neil Napier returned to Grootfontein on the 26th of December that year. We changed the direction of the attack. Instead of going from south to north, we then decided to attack from east to west along the breach. And the first aiming point was basically just short of the water. The water spout causes the damage to the breach. And this time we decided, because of the belief that maybe the water was not solid enough for the detonation to happen or whatever, we decided that the bomb must impact the breach itself for detonation to happen. So it was going from east to west. And the 31st of December, we flew 2 sorties. The first sortie, early morning, about 8 o'clock takeoff. The bomb was unserviceable. We returned back. And in this case, again, single aircraft flying. My aircraft was loaded with 2 H2 bombs. Giel van der Berg, Peter Kirkpatrick, number 2, they had 1 bomb, and they would have flown the buddy mode beneath. 1 squadron, Johan Rankin, officer commanding of 1 squadron. He was one of the escort guys. I had 2 Mirages, Johan Rankin and Trompie Nel as my escort. And with the bomb unserviceable before pitch point, we returned back to Grootfontein. Later that afternoon, we tried another attack, but again, afternoon, the weather built up over the target area, and again, we never even pitched. We returned back to Waterkloof for the weapon and the weather abort, as we called it. Then the 2nd of January, we tried again once. And again, the weather, it will take us, it took us since we got the message the weather is cleared, to get to the target area is just over an hour 15 minutes. So in summertime, the cumulus cloud could build up quite quickly. So we were late on the 2nd of January. The 3rd of January at 7:40, we got airborne for another attempt. The weather was expected to clear, the early fog haze, and it did clear. And as we got to the pitch point, the Boeing reported that there were MiG aircraft fighters in the Cuito Carnaval flying in the Cuito vicinity. So again, we did not pitch, and we just returned back to Waterkloof. Then at 11:40, we got airborne, and the Boeing in the air, and on the video you will hear they call blow bill, which was the call sign for fighters that's in the air. And after the launch, as we climbed for the launch, we gone through a little bit of cloud, and for some reason or another, I just decided it's time to launch. I launched the bomb to very much the dismay of especially Peter Kirkpatrick in the number 2 aircraft because of the amount of cloud which you could see on his little scope, and Neil had to navigate the bomb. The bomb flew all the way to the target. It impacted just next to the bridge, and there was a big water spout. The 2 recce's reported that they couldn't see the bridge at all because of the water spout that was created. And when the water came down and the visibility was quite a big section, I think the bridge is a total of 80 odd meters long, and about 20 meters of the bridge was totally destroyed. Somewhere along the line, and I must still look for it, I had a paper photo out of one of the local Angolan newspapers on the damage of the bridge. And I looked for it, but I couldn't find it yesterday. But I will still look for it, and the amount of damage on the bridge. So we returned back to Waterkloof. In fact, on the escape maneuver, and I mentioned I will bring it up at the end, staying a little bit on altitude, the Boeing called blow bill. The bomb was now flying towards the target. We were flying in the opposite direction. And when Neil said impact, I rolled the Buccaneer inverted, go down, although it's only 20,000 feet, but go down at 40,000 feet a minute, go low level, and just keep the throttles going. And Johan Rankin and Trompie Nel was sitting on the wing of the Boeing, of the Buccaneer. I got promoted to commandant on the 1st of January, so I was a commandant for 3 days. You are so used to call your senior still by the rank, and up to that stage, Johan, even I was a commandant, the early morning briefing, whatever, I still called him commandant. But then again, when we were low level, the radio call procedures in Angola was never to use rank. And going back south over Mavinga, Johan came on the radio and he said, hey, just retard a little bit on the thrust. Come back on the power. In Afrikaans, kom terug op die krag. And I said, Johan, you're making my day. And I brought back the throttles. When we landed, he was very, I won't say upset, but he wanted inquisitive about why did I say that I made his day. I said, I always wanted to hear a Mirage pilot ask a Buccaneer pilot to come back on the thrust. But it was a fuel consideration. It was not a speed consideration. And that, the recce's, the bridge is damaged. It was quickly packed up in Oudtshoorn, in Grootfontein, and that evening we landed back at Waterkloof, which was almost the end of Buccaneer operations for Modular Hooper. Although the Angolans got a system to cross the river again, and on the 3rd of February, the squadron redeployed back to Grootfontein with 3 aircraft. to do another attack on the breach. I think on the 4th or the 5th of February that day, Commandant Labuschagne, Giel van der Berg, Mike Boyer, and with their navigators, got airborne at Grootfontein, flew to that area. I think Commandant Labuschagne's airplane had a system failure on the bombs, and Giel van der Berg and Peter Kirkpatrick released another bomb on the target. As far as I know, that bomb was, for some reason or other, not successful either. So overall, the success rate of the weapons at that stage, which was very much experimental weapon, I will not say, although it was accepted as a weapon for the Air Force, we had lots of problems. Now even, 30-something years, almost 40 years later, I don't think the bomb was ever designed to withstand Grootfontein temperatures in the wind and the rain and the dust and on the flight line for that long periods of time. Although it was mil-spec for a lot of reasons, but the bomb was not super fine-tuned for conditions. And maybe that was one of the reasons why we had so many failures. And that is bomb, communication, bikini pods, failures, and we couldn't do the attack. But overall, the breach was destroyed. The bomb did work. Quite an expensive bomb at that stage. The figures I got, each bomb would cost about R1 million in those days. But I think it was a tremendous success for the South African weapons industry and the squadron to, in that short time, basically to develop a weapon, and we could destroy the breach. And that is it. Thank you very much.
I have to say to you, Colonel, I was sitting here totally enraptured listening to you. There's a few things, though, I made a few notes, if you don't mind, sir, just a few questions.
Go ahead.
For you listening here, guys, if you have questions to the Colonel as well, please put them down below. We will definitely ask the Colonel to come back and talk about his career as such, and perhaps we can answer questions. All for history. That's what this is about. It's fascinating to me, sir. Otjiwarongo. I'm from Korrigas.
Oh, okay.
So we used to...
So we're almost family.
We're almost family, sir. That's damn right. We're almost family. I couldn't believe it when you said that. And of course, I remember Otjiwarongo's rugby team was something terrible. They were actually better than the guys at Ochu, where we used to go to when you finished with school at Korrigas. You would go to Ochu. And then the games between Otjiwarongo and Ochu. Guys, if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's towns there in Namibia, in Southwest Africa, I think in Damaraland. But it's so seldom that you actually meet people from that area. So, it's like when you're in London and you hear somebody speak Afrikaans, when you shake hands with. So that's fantastic. I also recall now what the other thing was that Fossie was going on about. It wasn't only the Boertechnica story. It was also, I started calling the squadrons escaders and escadron. And apparently escadron is tanks. Got nothing to do with the SAP. So we learn here. I want to ask you, sir, when we were in Korrigas, it was in the early 70s now, there was my dad was friends with a German pilot of the Second World War. I can't remember the woman's name. He had a vicious snore. I always thought he should have been in the RAF. But he was a Stuka pilot. But the question to you is, did you ever meet these old German pilots perhaps as a child, and did they influence you in any way to take flight on as a career later in your life?
Of course, no. In those days, I never met any Southwest African Germans. Although my mother's German speaking, my family on my mother's side, they were all German. They were 6 kids. The first 3 were born in Germany, and the other 3 were born in Southwest. And my mother was born 1919. But just a little bit off the cuff, when I was on the Boeing squadron, we went to Germany, and a place called Ingolstadt, and we had to do trials with the German Tornadoes for tanking on the Boeing. And obviously, to the south of Germany, which is not far from the Hofbrau in Munich, we ended up in Munich, and it was packed. So there was a table open, and a German sitting there with the little Bayerische caps and their lederhosen, and the ladies dressed in typical German dresses. And I said, sit down. So we talked Afrikaans. We were about six South Africans. And eventually the lady leaned over to my side and asked me, what language do you speak? And I said, no, we speak Afrikaans. And she said, no, you're speaking German. You're talking Swiss German. And I said, no, but it's Afrikaans. But in any case. And we discussed these guys. I guessed them 20 years my senior, at least, all of them. The one guy had a big scar over his nose. And then the one pilot with me, Johan Swanepoel, saying that guy must have been a Stuka pilot, and that guy was a tank driver, and that guy was a this. But that was just an hour conversation in good Afrikaans. And eventually the band took a break, and everybody got up for their breaks, their normal breaks after the beer. But then the one guy came back and said, please don't go away. He asked the band for a special song. So this one guy came back with his trumpet, and he played the last step 2. Last post, step 2. I stood there, obviously got onto attention. These German family got onto attention, so they were Second World War vintage. I stood there in the Hofbrau crying, tears running down my cheeks when this trumpeter goes with the last step 2. It was amazing. So yes, that is maybe the closest I got to Second World War vintage people. Although the squadron honorary colonel, Judge Cecil Margot, he was the officer commanding of 24th Squadron in the war. So I visited him a couple of times at his home, and then we talked about the differences of the Second World War and our war. And 9 out of 10 times, there's no comparison. It was just so different in the mass of the Second World War to our limited type of warfare, although more modern, more missiles, more communication type of thing than what they had. But and the amount of losses they had to what we could never survive, losses the way they lost aircraft in the Second World War. So yeah, I had lots of talk with him. But that is about that.
Yeah, I believe Cecil Margot was a judge, Supreme Court judge. He was later Samora Machel. Wasn't he the judge overseeing the inquiry on the Machel crash, which was a crash, by the way. No one killed him. Yeah, no, it was a crash. The pilots were dropped. He had 3 big investigations. The first one he did was Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General of the United Nations in I think in the Congo. That was his first investigation, and then Samora Machel, and then eventually the Helderberg was his 3 big investigations that he led. Yeah, he was a tremendous guy, absolutely fabulous guy. You could hang on his lips when he talked. Beautiful. It's a funny thing, so you take me back now, because when I started my law career, I met an old attorney. My man must have been 80 in those days. I'm sure he passed now. Rest in peace, with the name of Dennis Freidenstein. And so Dennis was actually a fighter pilot. He was a Spitfire pilot in the war, SAF. And his mom is, do you know Oma Beskuitse? Die tannie went in that box.
Yeah.
Oma Grywenstein is his mother. That's
Okay.
what a small world. And he went to the Air Force, and when he came out of the Air Force, they founded a law firm, I don't know if it still exists, called D.M. Kish. And D.M. Kish had 4 partners, and all of them were Spitfire pilots.
Okay.
Since Dennis Grywenstein could speak Afrikaans in a certain way, not well, but he could speak it, they would send him to the more Afrikaans golf courses to try and get clients in, while they would go to the more English ones. So they had to plan these things, and for many years, unless you were a Spitfire pilot or some kind of something to do with Air Force, they wouldn't appoint you. D.M. Kish, wonderful people. I just want to say to you people also, we have a Johan Conradi who wrote several books on 24 Squadron, who is going to give us a series of talks on it as well. So we'll go into deeper detail with that. I want to ask the Colonel here. So I've heard a story. I don't know if it's true. It's probably not true, but it might be true. And it's a good story anyway. I was once sitting with my late wife, who was an aviator, and she had a friend there who was a more elderly uncle who flew in Vietnam. And he was apparently a phantom pilot there. And he said when they were staging out of Thailand to bomb Hanoi or someplace, they took a pet snake with them. Apparently they had a pet boa constrictor. Python, yeah, had one of those things with it. And this thing was actually quite adept to flying. It didn't really bother anybody. It would just lie there at your feet or wherever. And then they were flying, but he said before they would actually go into the combat zone, was talking about feet dry and feet wet. A very weird way of speaking. But anyway, they would then, according to him, dump the oxygen out of the cabin so that it doesn't explode if a shell hits it. But that part, I don't know if it's true. But that's what I wanted to ask you, if you people would follow a similar procedure. Because when they would go just on the oxygen through the masks, and apparently this snake got very upset with the AK shooting at them and started biting him between the legs. It was apparently a really nasty incident on the way back. And so he just dumped the oxygen again, and he just went up high as he could go to. The snake ran out of oxygen, but he didn't die. He just got, they say, a bit slow. Wasn't as bright as it used to be. Now my question to you is there any truth in this, and would you follow the same procedure? Would you also go through where you go up now, go on oxygen, dump the oxygen out of a cabin, or how do you do it?
No, Chris, it's I heard the story about the snake, and I've got a book here written by Colonel Boughton, but he was a F-105 pilot, what I call the Thunder Chiefs. And then he mentioned about the F-100 ground attack squadron. They got a snake from a forward air controller, a little python, was 2-3 foot long at that stage. And the whole story going about that python, the way that python grew bigger and bigger. And if they got into the pub in the evening, they couldn't get to the counter, they will push the snake towards the guy standing in front, and everybody will open up, and eventually they will have the counter as long as what the snake was. And the snake became like a 6-foot snake, 7-foot snake. They had 6-foot, 7-foot counter space. And one pilot decided to take the snake for a flip in a F-100. But he put it in a bag, and he had a little place where he could put a snake. But the snake came out of the bag and crawled in between his rudders, his feet, and the control stick. And for that reason, he went up very high, dumped the cabin pressurization, and he was on oxygen, obviously, on the mask. And the snake passed out, and he put the snake back in the bag, and he landed back. That's the story I got on that. No, we never had cases that we dumped the oxygen in a cockpit. In a cockpit. Our oxygen, whenever you started basically with taxiing, because of the microphone that's in the mask, It's a hot mic with your navigator, or if you're on Impala, you get airborne. The mask is on your face all the time. You can take it off because the cockpit is pressurized for a while, but then you can't talk. You have to get back with the mask on your face to the microphone. So you basically kept it on. And the amount of oxygen was regulated automatically with your increase in altitude. When you got to about 30, 35,000 foot, you would breathe basically 100% oxygen. If you get to low level, sea level, you breathe the same air as what I've got now and where I'm sitting at the moment. So we never dumped the oxygen out of the cockpit. We never had a procedure, and I've never heard of a procedure of that.
Okay, now that's fantastic, because that brings me to the next question. I know you flew Impala, so I've heard some people here on Legacy say to me that the Impala problem in life is your head can actually burn. You can get like sunburn on your head while your feet is sort of freezing. I don't know if it's true, but they swear to that. Would that be the same in the Buccaneer, or was it more gentleman-like?
The Impala, the story goes, I haven't got all the documentation. When they bought the Impalas from Italy, they had a fairly good heating and cooling system in the aeroplane. And apparently some technical guys in South Africa said, we don't need that because we don't get extreme temperatures like what they get in Europe for a air conditioning system for heat and an air conditioning system for cold. But I flew in Impala, the two-seat Impala on low level at Langebaan on a trial, and with a temperature gauge and the temperature at low level in summertime, going there past Van Reinsdorp and those areas in this, what is it, Kowe Bokkeveld. The temperature in the cockpit went up to 66 degrees C. And if you do that for an hour and a half, you get back your whole overall. You can actually take your overall and rinse it, an amount of sweat you lost. I think one or two guys actually got out and they weighed them before and after. I don't know how much, up to almost say a kilo they lost in an hour and a half because of sweat. The Buccaneer, it was different. The Buccaneer had an air conditioning system that in mid-summer in South Africa, if you get airborne, the pressurization comes up. It had a slit between your legs over here, where the air, and it actually blows out snowflakes in midsummer. So it was absolutely a fantastic system. Again, the aircraft, you needed that in the aircraft because it's a hothouse. The cockpit, the canopy, sun comes through. It's a real hothouse. It is pressurized. And if you don't cool it down, and you're not going to be able to concentrate for that long. My longest, I think, low-level flight was something about 2 hours, 32 hours, 50 minutes at low level, flying from Rooikop, Walvis Bay, all the way to Rehoboth, then south, gone around the Finger of God with 3 aircraft, around a couple of times, then in the Fish River Canyon, Karasburg, Uppington, Mafeking, Warmbaths, Bronkhorstspruit, Waterkloof, all at low level, 480 knots. 480 knots is almost 1,000 kilometers an hour. Absolutely fantastic. And if you don't have air conditioning there, you will have a problem flying the aeroplane.
No, that is impressive. I mean, for you people who don't know the maps, perhaps foreigners listening here, that's far. That's really far. But I have to ask you, sir, this H2 bomb, did it have any Israeli influences on it, perhaps, in the design?
Koos, I don't think so. I've never read any information about the Israeli influence on the design. It's obviously whatever it was Kentron designed. The TV camera and the glide was a company I think called Eloptro. They they cut the lens and the TV camera, but the control surfaces, that was Kentron design. The explosive part was a Kentron design. Eventually, when it became a nuclear bomb, it was obviously ICOR. They were involved. And even on that, the information, I got a little book that General Jan van Hogenberg and the guys from Kentron and ICOR wrote. In their book, is there were no influences from Israel on the atomic bomb of South Africa. Although there's lots of people saying there was, but I trust them because they were the chief of the Air Force in those days and the chief of Kentron, and obviously they said there was nothing. But this flying bomb, I don't think, because Israel itself didn't have a bomb like that. They've got laser-guided bombs. And we had a project, and I know of some of the guys that went to Israel for the laser-guided bomb itself, which is a down-to-one type of bomb. But you need a designator. And the designator could be from the ground to the target, line of sight, obviously, because it's an infrared beam that they shine onto the target. The target then disperses the beam. The aircraft bomb picks it up and then drops it onto the impact point of the beam. Or you have another aircraft flying, and that aircraft is totally vulnerable to designate the target from that aircraft. So it's not a for our purposes, it wouldn't have been a good bomb. If you take Angola and let's take reconnaissance forces to take that target, there was not enough space in Angola for them to at least be 3 or 4 kilometers away from the target and have a clear sight of the target with the trees and the vegetation in Angola. That apparently that the designator also makes a hell of a noise when it starts designating. That will give the position away from the guy on the ground that's doing that. So it was never used, as far as I know, in the Air Force and in Angola operationally. They used it once or twice on the weapons ranges for demonstration, but that was it. It was never operational with us. In Israel, I think it's a different story. And if you now take what happened in Gaza, there's no threat. They can fly around. Now they've got drones that do the designation. In those days, we did not have drones to do the designation of the target. So, it's a different ballgame from then to now.
Yeah, I asked actually Special Forces about it, and they said to me, I must remember they carry whatever they work with. And apparently these things were not small. And
they were not small. I think they would have had about a team of 5 to carry, and if they go in a small group, it's 1 or 2 in the small reconnaissance group. Well, put as 2. Not, I think very seldom they were only 1, but 2, but not 5. That becomes a big operation for them, and it's not safe for them.
No, they like the groups of 2. And it's right what you said, of course. GPS is a US military thing, which is why here in Thailand they're moving away from GPS now to the Chinese copies of it. Or perhaps not a copy, but it's obviously a system. I just want to be sure for history's sake so that people understand that the H2 bomb is a glide bomb. It doesn't have a propulsion. It doesn't have an engine or something in it. It goes on gravity. Once you release it, it's going to go down. It can't go up. But it has forward momentum because of speed. Because it's going...
The flying mechanism, the flying computer in a bomb maintains 250 knots. We release at 350 knots. Then it will come down and then it will zoom a little bit till it gets to 250 knots and go down automatically again. When I left the Air Force, or when 24 Squadron was abandoned, and if you look at on Google and you go Raptor, they were busy with ideas to put a small little, let's call it baby B engine on the aircraft, just to get that sink rate and increase the distance to up to 100 kilometers. But the bombs that we used was purely a glide bomb.
Now, Does it hang externally on the aircraft, or is it inside the bomb bay, which I know is weird because it spins, it turns.
Yeah, no, the H2 hangs externally. On the inner pylons of the Buccaneer, there are 2 pylons inside and then 2 outside. And that was one of the reasons why the Buccaneer was selected to use it. That pylon, that inner pylon, was stressed to carry up to 1,000 kilograms, where the outer ones could carry 500 kilograms. So we could only carry it on the 2 pylons. We could only carry a maximum of 2 bombs. In the bomb bay, we could carry 4,000-pound bombs, 2 behind each other in the bomb bay. And as you say, it rotates 380 degrees. It swings around. To open the bomb bay, yeah, I think it was too big with the wings to fit into the bomb bay area, but it hung externally. I was also sent photographs which we can insert eventually on the video.
This is fascinating to me. I'm thoroughly enjoying myself. I just want to be sure here that I've heard a story somewhere that if you have this bomb and the Mirage have this bomb, you can out-accelerate them. But I know it depends on height and so, but in short, sir, yes or no?
I would say no. The Mirage maximum speed is much faster than a Buccaneer's maximum speed. But if we have to fly a certain distance, the Buccaneer will outperform the Mirage in that sense. They had many years ago with Mirage 3s, before the F1s arrived in the country, they had a thing they called a tip-to-top race. That was from Waterkloof to Durban. And in fact, from the, what was it called? The Tower, Brixton Tower in Johannesburg. Go past the Brixton Tower, overhead Durban Airport. And the Buccaneer went through low level at 550 knots all the way. And I think that first leg, the Mirage had to climb to altitude and then go down. It couldn't go low level all the time at that speed. It didn't have the fuel. And on that short leg, I think the Buccaneer won. I must go and correct myself. But there's a minute or what difference between the two. Then it was from Durban to Cape Town. And the competition went a little bit further, land in Cape Town, get a taxi or whatever, up to Table Mountain. The guys eventually first at Table Mountain. The Mirage won that one. And then the third one was from Cape Town back to Waterkloof. And the Buccaneer can go Mach 0.95, which is 0.95 the speed of sound. The Mirage could go Mach 0.95, 99, Mach 1, can go Mach 2. But the moment a Mirage go Mach 2 and it flies I went Mach 2 at 49,000 feet. But at that stage, at Mach 2, you use a gallon of fuel per second. And a Mirage could carry internally a total of 600 gallons. That means 600 seconds. So it cannot go Mach 2 all the way to Waterkloof. But the overall tip to top, the Mirage eventually won the 3 legs combined, and the Buccaneer was very close to the Mirage. On the Mirage 3, on takeoff, if you take off in a Buccaneer at only 12,000 pounds of fuel, you release the brakes, Mirage 3, not the F1. The Buccaneer accelerates the Mirage up to about 300 knots. Because when the afterburner comes in, it takes a little bit of a time for that afterburner to be totally effective. And then the Buccaneer is ahead. But at 300 knots, the Mirage will come past the Buccaneer if you're looking for parking space. So there are certain competitions. As a pure Buccaneer pilot, I will say we outperform a Mirage in lots of cases. But that was mainly fuel connected and range. The amount of weight we carry. In Modular Hooper, the distance from Grootfontein to Cuito-Carnaval, where the Buccaneers carried 10 250-kilogram bombs for every attack. The Mirages, with external fuel tanks, could only carry 4 bombs. Because they couldn't do it without external fuel tanks. Obviously, the moment you put external fuel tanks, your fuel gets your bomb load gets less. So, yeah, in that case, bombs on the target, the Buccaneers outperform a Mirage. So it's maybe semantic.
Is that why the Buccaneers, and I'm sure Johan Conradie will have a lot to say about this, but that attack at Kasinga in 1978, I understand a tank column or something started approaching Kasinga, and I understand General Viljoen was there, rest in peace, and he was, taking his ranks off to be sure that if he's captured that he can be perhaps an old sergeant or something and not a general of the army. And a Buccaneer came in with a fake strafing, what's the word in English? Strafing around, and to break those tanks, that armored column, to break them up. Is there any truth in that? I seem to remember this now.
Yeah, what they had the strikes at Kasinga, where the Buccaneers originally dropped 1,000-pound bombs. Then they went back to I think went back to Grootfontein all the way, or was it on Dongwa? Grootfontein maybe, to rearm. But they had 2 Buccaneers that was loaded with 68mm rocket pods. And they had 4 rocket pods each. The rocket pods gets only externally on the wing pilots. And the one, Kasinga was the one target. And then a little bit further, I don't know what the target's name was the second target, secondary attack. And Dick Warrenke originally went to Kasinga with his rockets, and he did a couple of supporting attacks with rockets with the ground forces, and he reported the tanks. I don't know if he did attack 1 or 2 attacks on the tanks itself, but then he called Dries Maree from the secondary target to come to and there's quite a lot of talk and writing about Dries Maree. He did attack the tanks. I think he damaged a couple, and then he ran out of ammunition. And he did dummy attacks, low level onto the tanks, which stopped the tanks long enough for the Pumas and the Freelons to land to get evacuate all the ground forces. So Dries Maree got a HC for those dummy attacks he did on the tanks at Kasinga.
That's a story I heard too, so it's incredible bravery if we think about it. I have a last technical question to you. Perhaps a silly one, forgive me, but I'm just thinking, if you are at altitude and you're quite high, and you now want to dive down and lose, get out of enemy air radar, and you want to go low, and you said to me you can go down 40,000 feet a minute, which is incredible. I suppose that's why that aircraft just looks extremely strongly built. I will play you guys a video of it here behind me. While the Mirages to me looked a bit flimsy. I'm not saying they are flimsy. I'm just saying they look to me a bit less strongly built. And you have those vicious things coming at the back, your air brakes coming out. My question to you, sir, is what is your angle of diving down there? And what's the chances if you do this wrongly that you're going to have a blackout, going down like that, or is that not possible?
No, it's the angle going down is about 75 to 80 degrees dive, with the barn doors at the back open, and you basically go. But at about 4,000 feet above ground, 4,000 or 5,000 feet, you start to ease out of the dive, and you accelerate your speed to Mach. At high altitude, Mach 0.95, and as the Mach number comes down, the indicated airspeed goes up, and when you get to below 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet, you got 580 knots, and you maintain 580 knots till you initiate your pull-up. And as you pull out of the dive, you will close the dive brake, and you will start opening the thrust to continue at 580 knots. Now, the descent itself will not let you black out. It's the moment you pull G, you go into a turn, you pull the G. That's when the blood will drain out of your head, and you will black out. But going down, it will not. What can happen is, and that is, it is not that. I don't want to say it's not safe. It is safe, but it's critical that if you at the Buccaneer ceiling could fly at 42,000 feet, but it handles very poorly at that altitude. I personally went up there on 3 occasions for test flights, and it's sluggish. It is not a nice aeroplane to fly. But at 30,000 feet, if you then roll inverted, you bring the nose down and you go vertically down with the barn doors open, you have to control the speed. If the speed build up Mach 0.95, you had to, the 80-degree dive, you had to decrease it to 70-degree dive, so that the Mach number doesn't keep on increasing. And then you can push the nose down again as the speed, indicated airspeed comes up. So then you control your speed with your dive angle, because the dive brakes are fully open already. And you keep it maximum. You can't go supersonic in a Buccaneer. You will lose the tail. It will break off. The forces, supersonic shock waves that form around the aeroplane will, the tail, high T-tail will just break off. And it is critical on the 9.5 speed. And that is what makes it dangerous if you can't control that. And but we trained. You start with lower speeds, you train up to maximum, and it's the same with low-level flying. 200 feet, 1,000 kilometers an hour, and you go down to on a radio altimeter at 80 feet, and the trees are 30 feet, 40 feet high. So you are 50 feet above the trees, and you get used to that flying that low. But you can't go. I can't get into a Buccaneer today and fly at 50 feet. It will not be safe at all. So that is but the difference.
Now, this never to exceed speed, sir. Is there like an alarm going off which will warn you, or will your navigator tell you to watch your speed?
The navigator can call watching the speed, but then again, the navigator does not have all the speed indicators at the back. He has got, I think, a Mach meter at the back and a true airspeed indicator at the back, which is being calculated for navigation purposes as true airspeed. It's a speed that you truly go through the air. Depends on the direction of the wind, maybe, and on the altitude above ground. But the Buccaneer, I don't think it had a warning for maximum speeds. It had just warning for lower speeds. The stall warning, basically, but not. I can't think. The Mirage had a warning when the leading edge gets too hot at supersonic speed. It will give you a little red indication. Then you have to reduce your maximum speed. But that is friction on the wings on the leading edge as the airflow goes, and obviously metal. The temperature influences the strength of metal. As the temperature goes up, the metal becomes less strong. And for that reason, the Mirage had a warning on that aspect. But yeah, the Buccaneer, as you mentioned in the beginning, the Buccaneer is a very robust, strong aircraft. The wings, for instance, was a solid piece of metal, and it was carved. All the metal, it's like... as jy hout op 'n draaibank sit en jy maak jou vorm, the wings are being carved, and then the inside of the wings where the hydraulic pistons and the hydraulic lines and electrical wires go, that was drilled into the solid metal. So the outer part of the Buccaneer's wing is solid metal. We always joke with the Mirage guys and said, but the Mirage is plastic. The Buccaneer is real metal. It was a tremendous aeroplane. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it was so heavy.
But we do know it's heavy. I mean, so when you fly it, was it a light aircraft with attached to the input, or would you fight with it?
No, it was a light aircraft to the pitch of flying, in that sense. But as you taxi on the ground, you could feel it's a heavy aeroplane. A little stone doesn't let it rattle, type of thing. Once you get airborne, the wings were very small, and we call that the small wings and the weight of the aeroplane. We call it ek moet nou my aerodie uitsort. Wing loading. The Buccaneer had a very high wing loading. The turbulence, where you fly in a Cessna, and any turbulence, the aeroplane goes and you get bloody sick, air sickness, whatever. The Buccaneer never feels that turbulence. If you feel turbulence in a Buccaneer because of the high wing loading, then it is turbulent. Then all other airplanes will stop flying. Mirage, the Canberra was even worse. But Cessnas, Impalas, they were all flying, stopped flying. The Buccaneer was just cruising along. It was solid. It had mass. If you turn, yes, you go a little bit, inertia takes you a little bit further. It couldn't turn as sharp as what a Mirage could turn. The inertia of that airplane, it's mass. But it was such a pleasure to fly in the sense of there's no turbulence. It just feels solid. It was actually absolutely fantastic.
Now, I do realize here, sir, that I'm really stretching the time here now, but I really have just one question which I really want to know. Does it look different when you fly over the ocean at 50 feet or 150 feet at maximum 500 knots, 480 when flying over the bush? Is there different in horizon and waypoints which you can see?
It is more dangerous flying over the ocean because you've got no external judgments of height. Obviously, if you fly that low level, you very seldom fly in the cockpit. You're flying outside on the horizon. The Buccaneer's radio altimeter was actually placed, like as I said over here, on the shroud of the aircraft. You could see the radio altimeter, but you see the outside of the horizon as well. And you will go up and down as the contours go into the Quito River, which is not high, but you're flying, and then the banks of the Quito River, a kilometer this side, a kilometer that side, because it's so wide, you're below the horizon in the Quito River. You can't get that over the ocean. The radio altimeter as well, you had a little mode selector. You can call sea state or land. Then the signal sending from the radio altimeter is more sensitive to read the radio altimeter height above sea level. But in land mode, you can easily fly into the water. Easily. Maybe not easily, but if you start turning, maneuvering, it is more difficult because you've got no references where the ground is and where your position is, except the horizon quite far out. It makes a difference.
It seems to me that the role of a navigator has changed, and he became also a weapon system officer or operator with a huge workload on him. Is that true, sir, or is positive that bad on the navigators?
No, their role has changed. The workload becomes quite high, and the safety aspects. And if I take H2, eventually it was qualified on the Mirage, but for the Mirage pilot, even fly in a buddy mode, he has to fly at 500, 600 feet because he's looking at a little TV screen to control the bomb. If he has to do release and control, then while he's turning away, he has to control. One pilot, it just can't happen. If you're in a threat area and there's electronic warfare systems warning you and making noises, you cannot concentrate on flying, handling the bomb, and handling the threats. And a single pilot, it just gets too much. Modern airplanes like F-35s, I believe, they're autopilot. They go over to autopilot. Their threat analysis is all through centralized computers. The chaff and the flares will be dropped automatically. And the computer will drop it. Pilot maybe won't even know about it. So, yeah, single cockpit in, let's call it the steam-driven age of aeroplane, is not always a safe solution. The navigator enhanced the safety of the aeroplane tenfold. And then, yeah, in the Buccaneer, he controlled a lot of things on the navigation part. But if you drop bombs, on the toss maneuver, the computer will, as you pull up 4G, the computer will release the bombs. If you're in a dive bomb attack, the pilot release the bombs, or the rockets, or the AS-30. Then the navigator sits there, he's got nothing else to do. So it depends on the phase. That's part of the training. And it's so good to fly with the same navigator for extended periods of time, because then half a word becomes a whole paragraph. But it's also wrong to fly with the same navigator all the time, because if you complacency also cause a problem. So if you go slightly off the rules or procedures, and it's acceptable between the two, but it's not acceptable for another crew. So procedures, and we change navigators on a regular basis. But when we went into operations, we flew with the same navigator for that operations phase.
Well, I wish I could speak to you still for many hours, and I probably will in the future. But we have to end this now, and I want to thank you once again for your time and telling us about this attack, which really, really supported UNITA at that stage, and the South Africans who were there at Q2 Carnival. I just want to say to all of you, it just so happens that I wrote 2 books. Well, I wrote many dozens of books, but in 2 of them, one called Codename Dawn, I actually do look at the death of Dag Hammarskjöld, because there were some people who said that the South Africans were behind it. They're ridiculous. It's not true at all. And also we look at another book, Codename Angel. We look at the South African atomic weapons program and came to the same conclusions, that there is no way that was Israeli based. The way the thing detonated, the South African atomic bomb detonated a totally different, unique way, which is how we know. But of course, getting those people to talk to us on the show is very hard, even after all these years. But sir, thank you for this. I really appreciate this session we had, and I want to invite you, as well as the rest of the members of 24 Squadron and other people. Guys, please come and talk to me. Come and tell us what happened. Come and tell us about yourself. It is very, very important that we can get the history straight, because, you know, there will always be these takkare en liberale wat, let me switch to Afrikaans. Julle weet, daar's altyd hierdie takkare en goed wat, maak nie saak wat jy sê nie, hy gaan altyd iets slegs uitbeeld van jou. Hy gaan altyd maak asof jy 'n krimineel op 'n ding is, wat jy verseker nie was nie. En as jy praat met jou vlieëniers en jou duikbootouens en jou offisiere van enige deel van die weermag, medies, leerders, maak nie saak nie, en praat jy met hoogs professionele manne. Maar wat hulle doen is, hulle gaan soek jy ouetjie uit wat altyd jy weet, 'n graad so 'n ding het, of hy's altyd kwaad, of hy's nou vies vir die samajoor, of hy het nou iewers weet, in sy lewe dit nou nie gemaak nie, en nou moet iemand blameer, en hy blameer nou natuurlik die weermag, of hy blameer die polisie, of whatever hy was, Pietkop, ek hier nie om nie. Die enigste manier, maar hoe ons dit kan teestaan, is om die waarheid te kom vertel. Die enigste manier is om te sê, boys, ek was daar, ek sê nou vir jou, dis wat daai dag gebeur het. En hierdie ouens was saam met my daar. Dan vat ons daai negatiewe beeld wat hulle so graag in die wêreld wil instuur oor ons, dan vat ons dit weg. En dis hoekom ons doen op Legacy wat ons doen. Ons probeer die waarheid kry en dit uitbeeld in die wêreld, en weet jy, dan is ons alright. Want as iemand my wil oordeel, of vir jou wil oordeel, is my eerste vraag is, het jy al twee kante van die saak gehoor, my ou? Dit is toch waaroor geregtigheid gaan. Al die alterim partem, as ons nou uit 'n regshooftaal wil praat. Luister na al twee kante voor jy iets wil judge. So ek vra julle mooi, kom praat met ons asseblief, kom vertel julle stories. Kolonel, weer eens 1000 dankies vir hier, ons waardeer die, en ek hoop om jy binnekort weer te sien.
Okay, plesier Koos.
I'm Phil Skellen. I'm the president of the NEC of the Friends, and I also serve on the Museum Council since 2008. I'm also a military veteran. I served in 3 SAI in the 70s and 80s. I am here to tell you a bit about the Friends. The Friends is an organization that is actually a force multiplier to the museum staff, and we're here to provide assistance in restoring aircraft, maintenance to the museum, and also to guide the public around the museum. We occupy the museum on a Saturday that the museum staff can have a day off and they don't need to be here. And that's what we basically do. In these functions, we identify projects and we obviously commission projects and we do them. We raise funds by various means, mainly selling beverages and food on flying days and on museum days. And that's our main source of income. And that's basically what the Friends do. We also hold regular meetings and we get people with stories to tell around the SAF or around aviation, and that attracts quite good crowds. And we also publish a quarterly journal, and that's mainly aimed at the SAF history or aviation history in general. We always need like-minded people to volunteer to assist us. We give training, and we also, for school kids, we also can help them with their community projects, that we can sign forms for their community hours. And we also need any donations of old books, aviation books that are going to the library. We currently have a library project, and we need all the help we can get. We need donations, be it in kind, be it in finances, that can help us finish the projects that we take on behalf of the museum. We have a website. It's www.fsaafm.com. That stands for Friends of the SAF Museum, obviously. And you can contact us there. On there is all the details. And you can get membership forms on the website. We also have, you can look us up on Facebook. All the branches have a Facebook presence, and that's where you can find us. Yes, we're looking forward to hosting you at our museums, and please come up and introduce yourselves, that we can give you a guided tour of all our artifacts, all the jets, all the transport aircraft, the Shackleton, and the helicopters, and so on.
Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell to receive notifications.